I am Henry Lee. I'm the director of the Environment and Natural Resource Program at the Belfer Center, one of the sponsors of this seminar, along with the Mosavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government and the Harvard University Center for the Environment. Before we start, let me remind you that this is a virtual seminar. We are recording it and we'll post it on the seminar series web site. So if you have a friend or a colleague who misses the talk, please let them know that they can watch it later on our seminar webpage. And we have registration links on that page for the next few seminars in our series. It is our goal later on in the term, if the university and circumstance permit, to try to move this back into an in-person, but at least through spring break, this series will remain virtual. We will be taking questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. Please click on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and submit your questions. I will synthesize them and ask them to Liza. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Liza Reed. She is the Niskanen Center's research manager for low carbon technology policy and is an expert in high voltage direct current, electricity transmission, and technology innovation, all issues at the center of the debate around the Biden decarbonization program. Before joining the center, she worked at the Great Lakes Energy Institute at Case Western Reserve University, and she represented that university in the White House Office of Science, Technology, Policy, Metro Lab Network. She has her PhD from Carnegie Mellon University in engineering and public policy, and also has master's degrees and bachelor degree in electrical engineering from, I get this right, The Ohio State University. I would also mention that when my students worked on their fall projects, many of them used your readings, and they urged me very, very strongly to invite you here. So you have a whole fan club already at the Kennedy School. So with that, let me turn to Liza.
Thank you so much, Henry. Thank you for those kind words. Thanks for everyone for being part of the reason that I am here today. I hope I can live up to expectations. So I'll be talking about the federal role in electricity transmission. And as I wrote here, the exploding federal role. It's actually a lot of significant changes have happened in federal regulation of transmission in just the past 6 months. But because they're very fresh, we also don't exactly know how they're going to play out. So we have these new authorities, but we expect they're going to revive some old tensions. It's exciting to be giving a talk about transmission. It is not something that people were talking about for quite a long time, actually. Transmission has been largely overlooked in the policy space, sort of historically. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why, and then the bulk of my talk will be about how that's changing. So for starters, why we're talking about transmission is that it's essential infrastructure for every decarbonization pathway. Study after study of decarbonization, cost-effective, particular decarbonization in the United States finds that we need 2 to 3 times more transmission capacity to decarbonize our economy by 2050. And the metric that they use for transmission capacity is gigawatt miles. So this is the capacity that we need over the distance. So that's what needs to increase by 2x to 3x. And there's 2 driving reasons that we need this much more transmission. One is kind of the traditional, what you think about electricity transmission. It gets power to the people. In engineering terminology, we tend to remove people from the discourse. And so we say it brings the power from the generation source to the load center, but there's people there, right? It is bringing that power to the people. Natural gas has had pipelines. Coal has railroads. We've always moved energy around the country from where the source is to where the sink is. But we can't move the sun or the wind, so we move it electrically through transmission. The other reason that we need significantly more transmission is to share that power across time and space. So this is particularly relevant when we think about managing major weather impact. So when there is a cold snap and energy demand increases, or even potentially some lines go down, as happened in New Orleans in the hurricane, the cold snap in Texas last year from Winter Storm Uri, the demand was much higher than the generation sources available could meet. Those are two different ways that more transmission can support in a weather crisis, literally sending more power or being a source of reliability because there's redundancy in the system from additional transmission lines. So this is sort of walking that line between reliability and resilience. And there's another reason we need transmission. I bring it up in particular because that's a two-way value of transmission. It is not just the historical from generation to load, right? It is not a one-way path. It's actually a two-way path where a place that is generating at one time of day might be a sink at the next time of day, and maybe has a partner at another part of the country where they're sharing their power back and forth. So 2x to 3x is a lot of new transmission. And JP Morgan did this very handy study for us in early 2021, us being just policymakers generally, that looked at the history of transmission capacity expansion over the past few decades, and then maps out one particular study, which is the Princeton Net Zero America study, at what capacity expansion Princeton finds we need in the next 3 decades. And you'll see that that increases very quickly, depending on which case you're looking at, but it's a significant uptick in the transmission capacity compared to what we've added in the past. So that's a lot of new transmission, and it needs to go just about everywhere. Again, this map is from that Princeton Net Zero America. It's just one exemplar, but it does have some key features that we find in all of these decarbonization maps. These thick purple lines are the high capacity lines. That's moving a lot of power. If you're an electrical engineer or just familiar with electricity, we're talking 345 kilovolts, 500 kilovolts, 600, 800 kilovolts if you're talking about HVDC. So we've got high capacity lines that are crossing multiple state lines. And herein lies the problem, because transmission is historically hard to build. Here are just 4 examples from the past of projects that have been canceled in just the past 4 years. The Plains and Eastern Line was proposed by Clean Line Energy as a 720-mile line, bringing 4,000 megawatts of power on an HVDC transmission line from Oklahoma into the Tennessee Valley Authority. This line ran into multiple different barriers that transmission development experiences. It ran into siting barriers. It then ran into power purchase agreements issues. The Department of Energy was partnered with Clean Line during a changing administration, and due to some of the challenges that Plains and Eastern had closing all of these issues out, the Department of Energy pulled out of that partnership, and eventually the Plains and Eastern Line was essentially canceled. Another example is Northern Pass. We've got 2 examples up here for our New England audience members that you might be familiar with. Northern Pass was 192 miles of power lines from Canada into New Hampshire, bringing about 1,000 megawatts of power. This was a project that was contracted by the state of Massachusetts to help it meet its clean energy targets. It was denied by the New Hampshire Site Evaluation Committee, even after they had changed the line, including undergrounding part of it to maintain some of the sort of view shed and scenic aspects of New Hampshire. The Site Evaluation Committee still decided that this line was not appropriate for New Hampshire and wasn't bringing the appropriate value to New Hampshire, given what they saw as the costs and the impacts. Next is Independence Energy Connect. This is actually 2 lines totaling just 45 miles. So these are 2 pretty short lines from Pennsylvania to Maryland. So they were connecting 2 existing high voltage lines, so 500 kilovolt lines, that was going to allow more power to flow from Maryland into Pennsylvania. It was approved by the state of Maryland. It was denied by the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. And so now those lines are going, if they get built, are going to terminate right at the Maryland border. This is just a map of one of those lines. And all of this is the Pennsylvania part of the line. So we've got significantly less line. And so we're not interconnecting. Maryland does not get the connection into the 500 kilovolt line in Pennsylvania and can't bring that lower cost energy down into Maryland to relieve known, existing, and increasing congestion issues. And then finally, Very recently was the issues and the tensions with the New England Clean Energy Connect line. So this was Massachusetts Redux, Massachusetts Part 2. After Northern Pass project fell apart, New England Clean Energy Connect was selected by Massachusetts again to help them meet their clean energy targets. Similarly, still bringing clean energy down, hydropower from Quebec down through Maine this time. This line was approved by the state commission, initially approved under a Republican governor. When that administration changed, the Democratic governor also endorsed this project. The project was being built very far into development, actually, when the Maine voters got an initiative on the ballot that said the legislature should have to approve these projects rather than the public utility commissions. And the wording of that ballot initiative was intended to impact this project. It applied retroactively. The ballot initiative was successful. And so this line is still in litigation, determine if that ballot initiative can be applied and how it will be enforced and what that means for the line. So this is just 4 examples that were easy to pull of the last 4 years. There's been any number of these in the last decade or two, but actually maybe not any number, about double, right? We've got maybe a dozen total of examples like this, because these sorts of barriers put developers make them very wary of building transmission lines. So it's very rare that you even get high capacity interstate lines because of all these barriers. So last year, Niskanen Center got together with the Clean Air Task Force to look at this problem. As you saw from the Princeton net zero example, we've got a lot of clean energy infrastructure to build. Transmission is enabling infrastructure, but it is also currently a bottleneck. We do not have enough. It is getting in the way of clean energy deployment. And so we pulled together a workshop of experts to address this issue, and we published our results in August. And we looked at this from a policy perspective across a spectrum of private enterprise to public initiative. And what types of policies do we have, and what types of policies do we need to address this problem? We created a framework, a 5P framework, about what issues impact transmission development. And so I'm going to go kind of counterclockwise, starting at planning. And so the 5 Ps are planning, permitting, participation, paying, and process. And briefly, planning is where we're going to need transmission lines, right? What does demand look like? Where can we build generation? How is the system going to work together? What are the overall impacts? That's what goes into planning of transmission. It's the 5, 10, 15-year outlook that helps you start designing projects that you're going to build. Permitting is specifically where the lines is going to go. You need permits to site the lines to get sort of legal rights to the land where you want to build the lines, but then you also need permits through Environmental Policy Act, right? You need Clean Water Act permits, Clean Air Act permits, right? Sort of all different permits in order to commence construction or complete construction on a project in a given location. Then we have participation. This is a P that we are really adding to the discourse. The way that transmission is traditionally developed, there's participation within planning, there's participation within permitting, but it is not sort of inclusive from the start, right? So different stakeholders are being engaged in planning, different stakeholders are being engaged in permitting, particularly landowners feel like they're not being engaged in the process, or community members aren't being engaged in the process until basically all the decisions are made and they're just being told instead of being able to kind of be part of solutions. So that's something that we feel really needed to be added to the conversation. Next is paying. Again, semi-self-defining. How do these projects get financed? It's actually incredibly complex. If you are a merchant developer, sort of outside of the traditional transmission development system, then you're financing through a power purchase agreement. You are connecting that generation to that source, and you are getting paid for being able to provide that power. But there are much more complicated mechanisms because, as I shared in the intro, not every transmission line is direct like that, right? So if you are part of a reliability or resilience and power is going in both directions, this financing can get a lot more complicated. And then the last P is arguably the most important because it's this meta P right, that kind of goes around all four of these. We've got these four puzzle pieces together, but the puzzle that they complete is the process. And herein lies kind of the biggest problem that transmission development faces, is that there is no process. And anybody in innovation or business development in any sector knows that you need a repeatable process so that you can scale. That's how you do things quickly. That's how you learn so that you can get them less expensive, right? And we have no learning curve in transmission because what we have is a lot of canceled projects, and every project has had a unique circumstance, or at least that's how it is presented, right? That these are unique challenges and unique issues for this project. And so we're unable to get a process, which means we can never get to speed and scale. So this is what we put forward with the Clean Air Task Force as things to consider. And we looked at solutions then across this spectrum. And I do not expect you to read this slide. This is for illustrative purposes only. The key point is that we created a spectrum from private enterprise to public initiative. And we listed the four main Ps, right? The four puzzle piece Ps: planning, permitting, paying, and participation. And in the first part of the workshop, we laid out what are the existing policies, what is currently in place, where that P, that sort of meta P for process, is determined by how they knit together. But first, we sort of wanted to get a map of what all of the policies in place were. And then we did the main part of this workshop was to discuss, how can we broaden this? What are other policies that we could look for? And so then we filled out this space with other ideas. Again, trying to balance private enterprise and public initiative, we built out this spectrum. And our approach to this problem wasn't from a solutionism perspective, if you will. We didn't go in assuming that we knew that the answer was a public initiative or a private enterprise. We really wanted to explore the entire space, because the most effective policies are the ones that can get passed and then implemented, right? These are two key barriers. And transmission development has seen struggles in both of them. And so a key step to bringing any solution forward is to be engaging policymakers, industry professionals, and other leaders and stakeholders in this whole conversation across the private enterprise and public initiative spectrum to come up with solutions that can be effective. And again, throughout that discussion, ensuring that we're getting this meta P for process that is repeatable. So we published this report back in August, which is the time that the bipartisan infrastructure package was being discussed. And in fact, in the fall, Congress passed some legislation that included quite a bit of transmission legislation. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was passed by Congress in the fall and then signed into law by President Biden in mid-November, has three primary changes to policy for transmission development. One of those is expanding the data that the Department of Energy can use to study transmission. Another is expanding the mechanisms that the Department of Energy has to partner with developers. And then finally, there's a mechanism for expanding FERC's siting authority. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of these means. And I'm using @energy here. I'm using Department of Energy's Twitter handle because I think DOE, lest these slides get in other people's hands, they always know which DOE I mean. I mean the Department of Energy. So the first question is, what can the Department of Energy study? I've got a then and a now here. Back in 2005, the Energy Policy Act established this authority for the Department of Energy to study transmission congestion. So Congress has known for more than 15 years that transmission congestion was a problem and that it needed a federal focus. And in 2005, the Energy Policy Act said that the Department of Energy should study this problem every 3 years. And it should look at where there is existing congestion or capacity constraint. What does congestion mean in an electricity perspective? It basically means you can't get, what does congestion always mean? You can't get through what you need to get through. So it's a market opportunity, right? There's an opportunity to sell lower cost energy if you can just get the energy to this new location. So that's sort of where congestion comes from. But if you can't get the energy there, then they're stuck with higher prices, just because that's how markets work, right? If demand is higher than supply, you've got higher prices. So every 3 years, study existing congestion. And then there's this pretty long list of the things that they can consider when identifying areas that need transmission. Very technically, these are called national interest electric transmission corridors, It does not roll off the tongue. I'm just going to refer to them as corridors. So that's what the Department of Energy was tasked to do every 3 years. Under the IIJA, it now changes it to say at least every 3 years. So this is incredibly important, right? Because now we don't have to wait. When we get new information, we don't have to wait. The Department of Energy can immediately start acting. The other important piece is that it doesn't just have to use its own report. It doesn't have to use just its own study. It can use other information, and it's pretty broad. It actually very specifically says, or rather non-specifically says, other relevant information. The other important piece is that it's not just existing congestion anymore, it's also expected future congestion. This is incredibly important for transmission planning and expansion, because if you're studying existing congestion, you already have a bottleneck, and it takes 8 to 10 years to get a transmission line built. Now, hopefully we can speed that up with better process, but regardless, you're taking existing congestion and you're still looking at a couple to 5 or more years where you're experiencing that congestion. Whereas if the Department of Energy can start looking at expected future congestion, you can be a little bit more proactive and get that bottleneck out of the way. And then finally, it adds this line, which I love, when it's looking at where to declare corridors. So it can use any other information. It can do it as often as it wants, at least every 3 years. And when declaring corridors, DOE can consider economic impact, diversification of energy supply, all these things that they were already considering. And now the ability to enhance, the ability of this corridor to enhance the transmission of power. It is practically definitional, right? That a transmission corridor can now increase the ability to transmit power. So this is an incredibly kind of broad authority in the study, right? But this is still, at the end of the day, just a study. So what's the impact of this study? The impact of this study is what it means for actually building and siting transmission lines. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 created a two-step process. The Department of Energy had to do a study, and then once that study was completed, FERC could cite transmission lines, so they could approve for construction, they could cite and permit, this is our P for permitting, lines in those corridors. So the Department of Energy said, here's a corridor, now developers can come to FERC and say, we'd like to build a line. However, there's a bit of an asterisk baked into that citing, where prior, FERC could only cite those lines if the state had delayed its decision by a year or more. So this is about speeding up the process. If a developer felt that the state wasn't acting quickly enough in reviewing their application and approving their line, they could go to FERC. This was a big court case, actually following the Energy Policy Act, because in its initial interpretation, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, believed that they could cite lines if they were delayed or denied by the state. But the courts ruled that it was only a delay. They chose to interpret the language to say it's only in case of a delay. So if a state denied a permit, then there was nothing that could be done for that line. That is now changed. So the IIJA says that FERC can now actively overrule a state citing commission and decide to cite this line if it is in a Department of Energy corridor. So this is major. There's so much potential here, right? We have every authority at the Department of Energy to identify a corridor, and now FERC has the authority to overrule any previous decision. It's pretty expansive. There's even more. The other thing the Department of Energy can do is partner. So previously, public-private partnerships were available west of the Mississippi. And I say west of the Mississippi, it's very technically in the footprint of power market administrators, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into what is and is not a power market administration. It was essentially most of the land west of the Mississippi. And in fact, this was the authority that Plains and Eastern line pursued. They partnered with the Department of Energy in order to cite their line after running into other problems. Now, there's twofold ways that that the IIJA impacts these private partnerships. One is that they can be anywhere in the United States. So they're no longer geographically constrained to the footprint that's west of the Mississippi. And then the other is that the Department of Energy can enter into contracts to temporarily purchase power up to 40 years. So it's pretty long, but the goal is the Department of Energy agrees to purchase that capacity, right? That generation that's going to go from source to sink, temporarily buys that power on its own, then tries to market it. But that purchase agreement is more certainty for the developer, right? For their financing and their development, so they can actually get that line built. And then transmission is very much a, if you build it, they will come. Once you have that capacity, it should be very easy for the Department of Energy to exit these contracts, because there will be communities and companies now able to purchase that power once it is sort of real and certain. So this is incredibly significant. There's just so much authority in the IIJA. But where is this transmission going to go? How does this all add up? I already showed you this Princeton study. Here's where MIT thinks that transmission should go. Here's where NOAA, the Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, thinks that transmission should go. That's the green lines. These red lines are where NREL's interconnection seam study thinks transmission should go. Unlike Princeton, those last three studies each found this nation-spanning system of interconnected high-capacity lines, sometimes called a macrogrid, as the least cost path forward. So that's a lot of potential change in the federal government. And between DOE and FERC, there's now this incredible authority to build transmission anywhere in the country. But it's all fresh and new, and we don't know yet how it's going to be used. Presuming that this authority outlasts the legal challenges, DOE could build transmission anywhere, but they've indicated in their notice of intent that that is not their intention. So 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks now, the Department of Energy released a sort of policy document, a notice of intent that describes the authorities in the IIJA and how they plan on implementing them. And they did specifically state that those corridors, which currently they could proactively declare, they plan on reactively declaring. So they want applications. They want applicants to come forward and propose a line and say to them, this is where we think transmission should be built. Here's where it's going to be cost effective and meet all of these barriers. There's a lot of benefits to this. One is that you can now streamline, right? Through an application and pre-application process, the Department of Energy and FERC can line up their siting and their permitting. They can line up their NEPA reviews and minimize sort of all the steps that a developer might need to go through and prevent it from having to be duplicated, right? So when we're talking about a process, one of the ways to speed it up is to streamline it. So there's the potential to streamline this process. My colleague, David Bookbinder, and I wrote about something else the Department of Energy can do with this route-specific application-driven authority. It's our view that this authority should be used very thoughtfully and carefully, and that within an application, the Department of Energy should require permits to be completed, for example, before they approve a line to a corridor. So you can go to our commentary post or ask in the Q&A, and I can dive into this a little bit more, but these are actions that protect landowners, protect communities, and protect the environment. Because natural gas pipelines have historically been granted permits and allowed to start construction even before the entire line has been approved, right? So part of it could be permitted and construction could be started. If the entire line isn't approved for permitting, the line could get canceled, but the land has already been taken and already been destroyed. So it's incredibly vulnerable for litigation. And so one of our recommendations is that DOE seek a way to amend sort of how FERC has been citing natural gas lines by thinking very differently about how they cite transmission lines. But wait, there's more. You'll note that I don't have any time to talk about more, and I actually had no intention, don't worry. But I did just want to raise that in addition to the IIJA, FERC is undergoing a rulemaking. Last July, they issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, an ANOPR, on building the future through electric regional transmission planning and cost allocation and generator interconnection. That's 3 different things. So we expect one or more rules to follow from this. From the title alone, it's clear that they want to address planning and paying aspects of the 5 Ps. We encourage them in our comments to consider participation throughout and to seek to create a standardized process for engagement. there's a lot of potential for change under this FERC rule, but it's not clear, again, that we're actually going to get a streamlined, repeatable, scalable process. So before I wrap up, let's look at the landscape since our report came out in August. You'll see in the solid, I've put what has actually happened: enhanced backstop siting, streamlined NEPA potentially, public-private partnerships expanded. What I didn't mention, it wasn't in the IIJA, but DOE put in its notice of intent that it is intending to kick off a national planning process. So that has a lot of potential to be sort of the federal government leading more broadly on where transmission is needed. And then in dotted lines, we have things that are still up for grabs. So these are FERC orders on planning and cost allocation that I already noted, a transmission investment tax credit that was proposed as part of Build Back Better to be determined what, if anything, moves forward from Build Back Better. And then here in red, I highlight participation, because one of the reasons we brought it to the fore in our report is that it is not being brought to the fore in enough conversations, right? And participation needs to be part of an inclusive, transparent, scalable, and repeatable process. So there's a ton of potential. There's, as I said in the title, an exploding role for the federal government, but there's still no clarity on exactly how that process will work out. And there's pending almost guaranteed litigation to determine what the future of transmission looks like. And I'll leave you with one final thought, which is a macrogrid. None of this addresses the potential for this nation-spanning interconnected grid of high voltage power lines. And that potentially is a future federal role that would need congressional action in order to implement. So that was my fast and furious summary of everything that has happened in transmission in the past 6 months, which is quite a lot. So thank you again for having me. And Henry, I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. You've put a lot of interesting material and ideas on the table. I'm going to take my own prerogative here and ask you a couple of sort of mega questions. You look at large movements of power and the whole idea of corridors. And I know out here in the Northeast and the Atlantic states, they're looking a lot at offshore wind. They're thinking of bringing in up to 50 gigawatts of wind if you go from sort of North Carolina north to Maine, and you look at what the states are projecting. And they're looking a lot at what lines might have capacity and what new lines going from one place to another should be built. But now this may show my ignorance of this system, but power tends to go where there's least resistance, as I understand it. And therefore you have a system with the exception of Texas for a minute, you have a system where power flows around. If I suddenly introduce a lot of power, it's going to flow in all different directions. So the notion that I could build 2 or 3 large lines from point A to point B doesn't necessarily mean that my system can absorb it. I need to redo the system. What is there in these new processes that is going to look at the transmission system overall, as opposed to single corridors, or what we used to call the contract path?
Right, right. So this aspect of the transmission system being completely interconnected is an incredible technical challenge that transmission faces. And it's one of the reasons that other metaphors for infrastructure tend to fail. Because as you know, power does go to the path of least resistance. So highway systems don't really work, right? Because a backup in New York is not going to cause a backup in Oklahoma City. But it could in the electricity transmission system. And anyone who lived through the Northeast blackout of 2003 doesn't need a reminder of that, right? Small issues in the Midwest cascaded up through New York and New England and caused blackouts for days. So this is absolutely salient and relevant. There's a couple of things that are happening that are in the mix in what I discussed. One of them is the national planning. So DOE mentioned that they want to do national planning And that's a full picture, right? That is looking at a full picture of how multiple different lines, right? What is a system perspective? What are our goals? How could we meet those goals? And how do you build it piece by piece, right? Because as you said, just building one line at a time is going to have major impacts. So in the words of Mainers, right? You can't get there from here, right? You can't get there with our current planning process. The other piece is that even the corridors are allowed now to look at existing and future, right? So that future piece is part of the argument now for even how you could apply to build a transmission line. As you say, there's going to be a problem if we don't increase capacity in this area. The other thing is something called the interconnection queue. So that was part of the FERC ANOPR, right? It's transmission planning, cost allocation, and the interconnection queue. So the interconnection queue is within each, without getting into too much more alphabet soup here, there are groups of transmission operators called regional transmission organizations or independent system operators. And traditionally, when a generation source, like you mentioned, right, if you're going to tap offshore wind onto the grid, 50 gigawatts, probably a gigawatt at a time, right? There's going to be major impacts on the whole system. So the interconnection queue is the way that these transmission operators do a power flow analysis and say, hey, here's where the power is going to go when you add all that. And then they identify issues in the system. And then they build transmission to account for those issues. But it's a queue because you got to queue up and you cannot get out of the queue until the system issues are fixed, right? So they don't let you hook up until the system is ready for you. But because transmission is such a bottleneck and we've only been looking at existing capacity, not future capacity, that queue's been incredibly long, right? It's harder to get projects on. If we can be more proactive in building more transmission, right? It's a little bit transmission all the way down, right? I'm giving you a turtles all the way down answer here. We need transmission so we can build more transmission, but it's also very real. So the three things are that national plan, the interconnection queue, and then the third one is simply power electronics. So electricity doesn't have to flow to the path of least resistance. You can change the quote unquote resistance experienced on the line with power electronics. There are systems called flexible alternating current transmission systems, that's FACTS. And then there's high voltage direct current, my favorite technology, right? These are different power electronic systems that can actually choose how the power flows. And if we can get more of those onto the system, then we worry less about, sort of the world gone wild.
Okay, let me push a little harder.
Okay.
And I'm going to give you a question that's one of the audience says is, how will these DOE FERC possibilities interact with the existing RTO, ISO planning processes? And particularly if you look at where those processes are right now, and you look at the 10-year forecast, only PJM has taken a lead on this whole question of, for example, decarbonization. So how is FERC and DOE going to work with the RTOs?
Yeah, so my short punty answer is we'll see. That was their first bullet point in the NOI is we intend to engage in the existing sort of congregation that RTOs and ISOs bring together. But my slightly more nuanced answer, it looks like this is Guillermo's question. Guillermo, is there's a couple of things. One is the FERC ANOPR is expected to address transmission planning. And one of the things that is being proposed is this idea of scenarios, right? That FERC will say that transmission planning needs to change, right? And that existing RTO process, FERC does have the authority to influence. And one of the things that people think they might say is RTOs now need to look at a number of scenarios, right? What is a high growth scenario? What is a high renewable scenario, right? And then from that scenario analysis, get a better sense of what are the most likely transmission lines that are going to be needed and kind of get different things in the queue than what is currently in the queue, which tends to be only looking at very sort of short-term needs as opposed to the medium to long-term needs. So that's a FERC possibility. And the DOE possibility is very much an open question. And how it falls on that public-private spectrum is going to be determined by how we discuss and influence policy in the next 5 to 10 years, right? Because it is the DOE national planning process in particular is fairly independent from anything else that is happening. So how DOE engages, how RTOs and ISOs choose to engage, but then more importantly, any future action Congress chooses to take on what a national plan from DOE means and who should be using it and how it should be used or implemented will be really important.
So there's a fair amount of uncertainty still out there. Let me
Absolutely.
throw another piece of uncertainty at you, which is, and again, I'm going to read this, is that can you shed light on the federal obligation to harmonize with state level laws and policies? For most of our history, the states have regulated the electricity system, including transmission. The development of ISOs was a logical step, but it was moving some authority away from the states. Mm-hmm. Now we're moving even more authority away from the states. It's logical that we're going to have a few court cases on this. But how does this process at least give some recognition of the role of the states?
Yeah. So the role of the states is kind of crucial in how we manage it and understand it, because there's value and knowledge that state utility commissions, right, and state siting boards have about why they may or may not want a transmission line to go through their state. I'll refer the author of this question to a paper by Alexandra Klass and Elizabeth Wilson from Vanderbilt Law Review 2012 that defined transmission development as a federalism mismatch, where there's a status quo bias a little bit in this question that says because it's always been under the authority of states, it's so important that we harmonize it. This federalism mismatch paper says where we are now, like the challenges of transmission and the opportunities that transmission provides and the benefits are more federal. They are interstate, they are national when we think about decarbonization. And so an appropriate application of federalism would say that is now a federal authority, or there's some aspect of it that should be a federal authority. There was another transmission bill, in fact, that is still live. It's in committee in Congress called the CITE Act, Streamlining Interstate Transmission of Electricity, that actually only carved out specific lines for federal authority, right? And it proposes that interstate high capacity lines are FERC's authority to cite, whereas everything else is within the state's authority, right? So there's different proposals out there. What the IIJA says, right, is that everything transmission, the federal government can overrule. But Richard Glick specifically said last week or 2 weeks ago that it is not FERC's desire to be running all over states. And FERC has a national and state, the FERC commissioners are working with a group of 10 state utility commissioners on the federal state task force. They haven't specifically addressed citing. They're looking at other pieces, but I hope, and I know a number of others hope, that they're going to talk about citing at a future meeting and exactly address this question: is what is the appropriate level of harmony? At some point, something has to give, right? I do firmly believe that there are aspects of this that absolutely belong in the federal authority, and everything in between will be a negotiation and a litigation in court cases.
But you have to keep in mind, in terms of when you look at the state authority, it's not just the public utility regulator or the siting authority if it's separated from the regulators. It's also areas like land use. It's like in our state, in Massachusetts, it's the historical commission has to have a permit for each one of these lines. Mm-hmm. Altogether, when you the water commission, they're all other state entities that are not economic regulatory agencies. They are environmental agencies or historical agencies. How do you bring those in? Because those permits can hold up a line just as long as the PUC does.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and I'm not entirely sure I agree on the premise, at least when it comes to transmission lines. And there have certainly been cases where where different permits have held up other linear infrastructure, right? And obviously we have seen sort of national headlines about where it has held up natural gas pipelines or oil pipelines. But in the cases in transmission, most of these lines, if not all of these lines, are being canceled because of cost fights or environmental fights, but not permitting fights, right? Like the issue was not that they could not get an environmental permit or couldn't pass the state permit or couldn't pass the national permit. Right? That actually isn't what we are seeing in transmission lines. I do think it's incredibly important for permitting to happen, right? For the correct boxes to be checked and the processes to happen to maintain the historical significance, to sort of maintain and protect the environment. If you're doing a federal process, I'm not entirely certain on this from the IIJA, but I believe it preempts some of those state authorities as well and has it run through the federal sort of Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act processes. So there's plenty of permitting that would still be happening along each of those spectra on the federal side as well.
All right, I'm going to read you the next question because the questionnaire knows this issue better than I do. But the proposed reforms of cost allocation, according to benefits and cost socialization, are mutually contradictory. This continues the doubt, the double talk that was prominent on Order 1000. Will this ever change to develop a coherent set of definitions and cost allocations? In other words, who's going to pay for these lines, and how do you implement the beneficiary pays policy that FERC enunciated many years ago, but has yet to been able to effectively implement?
This question is well taken, and I have a lot of sympathy with this perspective. I believe this is coming from Professor Hogan. I have been, I feel like skeptical is too negative, but skeptical from the beginning about FERC's ability to come up with a clear cost allocation mechanism, because it is not a responsibility of FERC, right? And one of the challenges with Order 1000 in implementation is exactly this, like this contradiction over who decides what the benefits are and who decides what the costs are. And if it's not a realized cost, we're now saying it has to be considered a cost and how we divide it up, right? It's a big mess. And in fact, it was one of the things that we mentioned in our report that potentially it actually could argue for more merchant transmission or a higher federal role, sort of either way. But what we have in the middle results in exactly this kind of contradiction where nobody can even agree on the definitions, and we're all sort of, I like this double talk. I absolutely agree. This is one of the sort of challenges with the existing utility structure. If we move to a more merchant transmission line, cost allocation becomes a moot point, right? Because that is the merchant's problem. Or if we move to a more federal role where there's an explicit definition, but that's, as far as I'm concerned, those are really our only two solutions. Because I agree with Professor Hogan that there's not really a sensical path forward in cost allocation otherwise.
Okay, there's a lot of talk out there now, not only about transmission lines, but also storage facilities. How do transmission lines and storage facilities, how does that whole planning process interact?
Yeah, so there's one of the debates in another presentation, I've had a slide about the tensions at play here, right? And some of them are real tensions like cost, and some of them are kind of this perceived tension. And I think storage versus transmission is very much a perceived tension. They're absolutely both necessary, right? And when we look back at Winter Storm Uri, folks were saying we should have had more transmission, but then we also had stories about people powering their homes from their electric vehicle for a period of time, right? I mean, storage is absolutely a resilience solution. It's not as much a reliability solution per se, although hybrid solutions like storage with solar, right, storage with wind, can help some of these intermittency issues. Storage and transmission are absolutely both ands, right? The high transmission gives us the ability to share across, but it's a little bit like a fire extinguisher versus your fire department, right? There's plenty that storage can do in the short term, but on a major scale, we need a fire department to be putting out the big blazes.
Okay, you mentioned that under the new law that DOE can go out and buy power. And how far does that go? I mean, I have done work in different parts of the world. Argentina, all the power is bought by the state, and it creates huge deficits in Argentina, and it's been a mess. So, what's the sort of, if you frame the DOE authority, what's the outer frontier of what it could do or should do?
Yeah, so the Department of Energy has been marketing power for decades now, right? And I didn't get much into power market administrations, and you should probably have a PMA expert on to talk about that because we've already reached the depths of my knowledge. But the PMAs have been facilitating the sale of federal hydropower for a long time. So in some ways, we have a bit of a mental model and even a policy model for the Department of Energy buying and selling energy. The transmission facilitation program, which is what this falls under, is pretty small from a dollar amount. It's a revolving fund of $2.5 billion, which isn't going to fund that many projects, right? So this is not a case of the Department of Energy is essentially going to fund all transmission development and then be stuck with the bill and trying to farm out that power on the back end, right? This is much more targeted at the Clean Line example where their power purchase agreement with the Tennessee Valley Authority fell through. The Department of Energy could sort of come in and smooth those humps, right? Because getting those agreements to merchant developers is crucial to merchant developers to get lines continuing to move forward, right? It's getting that money in the door. And part of their responsibility is to then get out of the contract. It is a revolving fund, and the Department of Energy is expected to exit those contracts as quickly as possible. So in the sense that anything could change, and this is a foot in the door towards something, towards a boondoggle, sure. But as it is written, it's actually a pretty narrow and specific use.
Okay. A lot, by the way, just as an aside, a disproportionate amount of the questions simply tell you what a fantastic presentation you made. So
thank you.
Your fan club still is at work here. Is that if I'm looking at all of these generation projects that are being proposed, particularly things like offshore wind, and you're looking at an ability to permit the generation side of this very quickly. If you look at transmission over the last 25 years, you find that the average length between the time that it is announced the intention and the time it is permitted and built is over 10 years. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge disconnect in timing. Now, maybe you can cut a couple of years off that, but you still have this this disconnect. Now, President Biden says we're going to basically decarbonize the electricity system by 2035. Do you think we're going to be decarbonized by 2035?
I don't believe in prognosticating. I believe in policymaking.
But do you think it's reasonable we will be far down that path by then, or are the issues that we've discussed here in this seminar going to make it very hard to come close to that kind of a deadline? They're
going to make it very hard. What gives me hope is a couple of things. One, the Department of Energy NOI is extraordinary. If you are in a transmission world, there's nothing in that NOI that really surprises you, except for the fact, what should surprise everybody is that it was spun out by the Department of Energy just 2 months after President Biden signed the bill into law. And it is very explicit and specific about what the Department of Energy sees as the value of transmission. So the NOI does give me hope because it says the Department of Energy recognizes the barriers and is all in on using their authority to remove those barriers, to get lines built. And I do think you can get them built faster because that 10 years plus, a lot of that is in the transmission planning process in RTOs, which merchant developers don't have to participate in, right? So you can get that part shrunk down already in merchant development. You just got to get through the interconnection queue and some of the siting and permitting challenges. The other thing that gives me hope is that storage and solar are always beating expectations on where prices are going to be and where their capacity is going to be, right? So we have other levers that are moving very quickly. transmission is going to be essential, but there's a lot of other pieces that are moving quickly. I very much believe, though, that this is just a moment for transmission that needs to be momentum. I don't think this is the end of what we're going to need from Congress, let alone the federal government, to address transmission, right? We're going to have more litigation and issues, and we're going to have more questions that we need to fix with regulations.
My last question is, some experts have said that renewable energy is going to continue to decline. I may not be a believer in this because I look at all these solar companies that are having a lot of financial trouble right now. But let's assume it is. And let's assume that the breakdown on wires versus generation is 40% generation, 60% wires. Could we look at a world 15 years from now in which 80% of the cost is going to be the transmission, distribution, and the grid system, and 20% is the generation cost?
Because you're saying because we're not paying for fuel anymore, that the fuel is essentially free?
Well, if it's solar and wind, yes.
Right. Yeah. I think we are going to see that shift. And what's going to be interesting is how those business models change too, right? Because even transmission and distribution, just like natural gas companies have had to change sort of how they are looking at their billing, right? Where it's a service and not just the gas that you are using as gas prices have changed. I think we're going to see changes in business models and costs of how distribution and transmission gets financed. And I really thank you for that question, Henry, because I think it's very important for transmission policy folks like me and the other folks who work in this space with me to think about. We talk about how it's going to be lower cost energy, but people are going to start seeing the shift in those bills, right? And it looks like I'm suddenly paying for a lot more transmission, right? And so we have to be really thoughtful about what promises we make and how we explain what that transition is going to look like, right? Because I think you're exactly right. The bills are going to change and people are going to notice, well, suddenly I'm paying for more transmission. Well, what does that mean? I thought my costs were supposed to go lower. And I think these are real discussions that are going to have to be ongoing for 15 years as we explain sort of the need for this and the obviously lack of pricing of things like carbon that makes other generation sources look cheaper than they are.
Thank you so much, Liza. This has been a great presentation. You've only reinforced your reputation at Harvard's Kennedy School, so thank you. Next week, we have another Carnegie Mellon graduate. Priyank Lathwal is going to talk about the whole question of pollution, decarbonization from freight trucks in the contiguous United States, the public health damages, and the implications for environmental justice. That will be on February 14th, Valentine's Day. There will be no session next week. We hope you have a good 2-week period, and we'll see you back at that time. Thank you again, Liza.
Thank you so much. Appreciated the questions from everyone and the interest. Have a great day.